Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and Janelle, who is normally with me because of COVID, we're limited to the number of people we can have on the set. So Janelle's taking today off. She's been doing several shows in the past, so now it's my turn. With me today is Sharla P Rausch, and we're going to talk about her family. One of the things that Janelle and I have found is we often do the shows on specific records or a research facility or something like that, but there's so much that you can learn from people and how they did their research. You know, I often find listening to people talking about their research, I'll hear about a group of records or a facility or something that sparks me to go look for that type of record or, look at that facility. So I want to ask, how did you get started in researching your family, Sharla?
Well, first, I'm not a trained genealogist. I've always loved American history and enjoyed family trips to historic sites, and I had an opportunity to live close to our early American history for 10 years in Connecticut, which was nice. That said, I gave little thought to my own family history. We didn't live close to either of my parents' families, and we didn't see them that often, and I rarely heard that many stories or had opportunities to talk with them. I did have the opportunity to spend some time with my paternal grandmother, who I adored dearly, and she was very proud of her French roots, though she never discussed what they were. Mm-hmm. I knew that her last name was DeVore, and she gave me some of her French books from when she was in a teacher's college, which I still have. My mother had become interested in both her and my father's genealogy in her later years. In fact, that was back in the 1970s, nice. And she wrote to the National Archives and the county historical societies and even the Soviet Union. At one point for her own, and I really regret that I didn't join her in some of this. And as we've talked before, what I wouldn't give for an hour to talk with her.
Yeah. All of my grandparents were gone before I got in. In fact, 20 years for the last one before I got into genealogy. So, like you, one question or an hour or just to be able to talk to them. We've talked before about my involvement in the DAR, and that wasn't something I was seeking at the time. I just very casually mentioned to someone that my mother thought we had somebody who fought in the Revolutionary War on my dad's side, and they of course reached out, and we did my lineage. Back, the genealogy back. And so I had a pedigree chart, but I really didn't think much about it. And then my mother passed suddenly. Mm-hmm. And I was with my dad for a couple weeks. And one of the ways we dealt with grief was to go through photo albums. And every photo had identifying who it was?
They did.
Oh, you're lucky.
And my dad, both my parents kept albums, and they were by decades. I mean, you could just follow the progression of the family. And so I asked my dad questions as we went through, and he told me wonderful stories and about the people. And so I asked him if I could do his history, which he was a member of the greatest generation, and he certainly was embarrassed to have that done. Mm-hmm. And didn't think it was special. And I convinced him that his grandchildren and their children would like to know about the family history and why the decisions were made that were made. And so he agreed to do it. And that got me reading a lot of the history and the social history of the times and pushing further back. And I got to tell you, some of it was hard for him. We got to World War II, and he was a young Marine in World War II. And he fought in the Pacific, and he had a lot of pictures. He was friends with a photographer who traveled with the troops and gotten additional photos. And sometimes he left the room. but he also had some fun stories. And I came when he passed, and I was going through his belongings. Actually, it was before he passed. He was moving to assisted living, and I had gone through his belongings at the house of 50 years, and I came across a letter, and that to my grandmother that had never been mailed, and I asked him about it, and he said that they were asked to write those letters. They were getting ready to invade Japan. And that they knew that the casualties would be high, and they asked them all to write a last letter home, and that was the letter. And fortunate for us, it was never mailed. But that got me thinking about the stories and the importance of telling the stories. And I know in his final days, I read him his story, and he continued to make edits and add different things. And so I think that's what got me going. It's not so much the genealogy as the family history.
And I was kind of like that. My mother's father talked about his parents coming over from Scotland to Philadelphia, and they came 18 months apart, and they were married the day after she arrived. But my father's family, all I really knew was that my grandfather said his father was an orphan. And he really wouldn't talk. In fact, after he was gone before I got into genealogy, but when I really got into it, I asked my aunt, who he lived with the last 5.5 years of his life, and she said he just would not talk about things, And the only really tragic thing that I know about was he had a sister who was about 2.5 years older than he was, who died actually before he was born, and shortly before he was born. And I mean, that's the only kind of tragic thing I've uncovered in the family, but he just wouldn't talk about it.
Well, and I think that's always the challenge for families, and that's why it's never too early to talk and to jot things down, and also keep your own thoughts. I think one of the things that had struck me with my dad is when I asked him about the war, and I asked him if he ever thought we would not win, and he said no. He said there was no doubt that we would win. We just had to get on with it. And he had a philosophy that it's a good life if you don't weaken. And interestingly, as I've gone through the family history, that seems to certainly be a theme. And I know you and I talked about which part of the family line to discuss today. And I said, I'm interested in the DeVore line, which was my dad's maternal line. And I think one of the things that intrigued me about that line was it stayed primarily in Bedford, Pennsylvania. And that was just over the border from Cumberland, Maryland. And in fact, in some cases, the family had businesses in Cumberland and lived in Bedford, or vice versa. In studying the genealogy and the family history, it was so interesting to see how much everything changed. They were on the frontier to begin with, and then things began to really change. And the Pennsylvania archives have been an incredible resource for me, especially the early history of Pennsylvania, as has the Bedford Historical Society, and the Mother Bedford website is a great website. And I was also fortunate to have the history of Bedford, Somerset, and Fulton counties, Pennsylvania. That was published in 1884, but the citations are phenomenal. And it really, really lays out a lot of the families and goes back. And that gave me a lot of good clues to follow. And then we've talked before about the DAR library, and in there I found the DeVore families, 1500 to 1992, if you can believe it. And Betty Mann, who's a trained genealogist, was the editor of that, and also family linkages. And the citations are phenomenal, which has just been wonderful. And for anybody wanting to do a family history, the library is terrific to go about that. And I was able to go to Abe Books, as we all love, for old books, and get a copy for myself, which is well bookmarked. My patriot, the first into Bedford County, was Cornelius DeVore. And he was from the New York, New Jersey mini-sink area.
Okay.
I'm not even going to begin to try to pronounce the church where he was baptized. But I did find his baptismal records courtesy of the New York Genealogy Society. They published those back in 1913, along with wonderful histories of the church and the people in the community. One of the things I noticed was that his uncle, William DeVore, and Aunt Katarina Schoonmaker, or Catherine Schoonmaker, were sponsors, which played an important role at that time. And that also helped me to track Cornelius in Bedford, because they all traveled together. And his parents, I have been able to identify then his parents and possibly his great-grandparents. His great-grandfather was a Huguenot, but I'm still looking for that final verification with the birth records or a will that make that solid. And William and Catherine first showed up in Bedford in 1774. I found Cornelius' oath of fidelity in Washington County, Maryland, which was where Cumberland was at the time, which was exciting to find, and I found that at the DAR.
And I want to point out, because as I talked to you or emailed you, it's so important to understand the changing of the counties and things, because you can have ancestors who, it may look like they've moved several times to different counties and they're still in the same spot they've always been. It's the county lines changing. So that's so important in finding the records that we need.
It really is. And at the time that they had gone to Bedford, there weren't all that many counties in Pennsylvania. And Bedford covered a huge space.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, since then, a number of counties like Somerset and Fulton.
How many counties are there in Pennsylvania? Do you know?
Oh,
I know there's a boatload of them.
There are a lot, but I couldn't tell you offhand.
It's not like New Jersey, where my father's side, they started out with 4 and they have 21 today. It's quite a few in Pennsylvania.
Well, there are, and of course, a lot of those grew up as the needs to make decisions, governing requirements increased, as well as populations and supporting those populations. So Bedford's, it's really interesting. It's, as I said, it's above Cumberland, which became a major transportation hub. And the Cornelius also was found courtesy of the Pennsylvania Archives on the Bedford militia rosters. Colonel Samuel Paxton's 1st Battalion, and he served from 1778 to 1783. I also found in the archives, certainly when he was in the militia, he was listed as a private. I later found in the archives that he was listed as a captain in 1786.
Okay.
So he clearly stayed with the militia. And you and I talked a little about Bedford County and its contributions to the Revolutionary War. And one of them was the 1st Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion. And they formed immediately after the shots heard around the world. Which we will commemorate tomorrow on Patriots' Day. And they marched over 500 miles to Boston to support George Washington in the trenches. And I wanted to read to you a little excerpt from a description, if I may.
Sure.
They are remarkably stout and hardy men, many of them exceeding 6 feet in height. They are dressed in white frocks or rifle shirts and round hats. These men are remarkable for the accuracy of their aim, striking a mark with great certainty at 200 yards distance. And the description goes on to note that on a quick advance, they're able to hit a mark 7 inches in diameter, at least 200 yards, and to shoot shots fatal to the British at twice that distance.
Yes.
And I don't read this just to talk about how good an aim they are. What I wanted to bring to this was that the survival requirements on the frontier were things that had prepared them for the fight for independence. And even with that, many of them were taken prisoner, particularly during the Long Island campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that gets me when you do family history is how emotionally you get involved you get with the stories.
Well, and you read about, the particularly that area, how tough it was, but other areas too when it was frontier. And the fact that they survived, it's kind of like I read a book about over time the conditions of coming over from Europe to the United States. It's called Coming to America. And I read this and I thought, how bad was it back in Scotland that my great-grandparents picked up, and actually all but my great-grandfather's oldest brother came over, but just the conditions coming over on the ship and everything, they endured that to get here.
And I think that family history is a good reminder of that. Mm-hmm. That because you are reading the histories of the times and you're trying to put the people in the context of the times.
Of the times, yes.
I think one of the things people don't realize about the Revolutionary War was that it wasn't just against the British. Mm-hmm. So the Bedford militia, because they were on the frontier, were fighting Indians.
Indians too, yeah.
And as well as those who had remained loyal to the king and the Tories, is what they called them. And for the Bedford militia, this was much of the fighting. And it's fascinating to read some of the correspondence available through the Pennsylvania archives from the Bedford militia to Philadelphia, and the executive committee. They're explaining that they do need some help. Mm-hmm. They've had whole communities wiped out. As well as militia, and quite a few atrocities. And what hit me was the scalping of children and things like that. So it was, they were difficult times they were going through, and it wasn't what we see in the movies or what we think about. And it was a difficult time for them. And they were fighting for their survival, just as the Native Americans were fighting to maintain their lands. And in fact, during the Revolutionary War, there were only 2 tribes that sided with the American Revolutionary forces.
Yes, yeah. So you found some interesting things in a will for Cornelius.
Oh, yes.
Something that was unique, although not, I've heard of some of these things, but a little bit more unique to his particular will.
It was fascinating. He had 10 children. He had 6 sons and 4 daughters. And he, during his lifetime, had acquired quite a bit of land. And in laying out which heir got what piece, he provided an incredible amount of detail. It was wonderful because there had been a survey done, which he would refer specifically to the survey. And when he would describe the piece that went to which son, he would indicate what neighbor bordered on it, or what tenants were renting it at the time, which is a great resource for someone else. And now when I'm hitting a sticking point, I look at wills of people who lived in the area I believe my ancestor did, to see if they're mentioned. He made it clear that the land was for the use of his son and their heirs, but couldn't be sold. Mm-hmm. and which I thought was interesting. He did have some pieces that could be sold, and in that case, he left his daughters money. And this is what was interesting. The money was to be handled by his two executors, which were his two youngest sons, and he specified that it was not to be controlled or interfered with by their husbands. And he named their husbands.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was kind of interesting. My first reaction was, my goodness, he didn't like the husbands. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, he may have wanted his daughters to have some personal security. Mm-hmm. Wanted to make sure that this was theirs to do as they wanted to.
Because one of the things we have to understand is in many states there were laws that, women were, once they married, they basically were under the control of their husbands. And he had the say of what was done with land that they owned or money or things like that. Women could not own property in their own name if they were married in various places and everything. So, my kind of read into it is he wanted to be sure that they were taken care of, and not that he necessarily had a bad relationship, but one never knows what may happen down the road. And so this was his way of securing that, if one of them happened to be a gambler or an alcoholic or something, they weren't going to squander that money, that his daughter would be and grandchildren would be protected under that. And that was important that he did that, because I'm not specifically sure what the laws were then, but knowing in general what they were in many places, that was his assurance that they were going to be safe and able to survive and be supported.
It's interesting in reading his will, because he speaks of his children and his wife in the nicest terms. He just, and I don't see that many superlatives. Mm-hmm. In that. What I found interesting in future wills of his sons is that one of the sons divided everything equally among his 9 children, male and female, mm-hmm. which I thought was nice. And then his son left everything to his wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it varies back and forth. As we talked about before the show, my third great-grandfather and grandmother were fairly wealthy, and the divisions were not equal among the children. And by the time he made his will, his one son had died. They had 15 children. The amazing thing for these children being born starting in 1811 is that they all lived to adulthood. There were none of them that died young, and no spaces that I can find in ages where there could have been a child die young, and they're all named in the family Bible. But, they were not equally provided for.
Well, he may have thought some needed.
Well, I know specifically his youngest daughter, who was my second great-grandmother, had a hard time. She lost a husband in the Civil War and was left with 3 children under 5 years old and all. And so she had a hard time even after she remarried after the war.
I have, in looking at the will of a different line, the ancestor spelled out what he had already loaned different kids, and then did the calculations accordingly.
Yeah.
Again, working toward fairness.
Yeah. One of the other things, because our time is getting short, that you put in the information was the wonderful maps that you found, the property maps for that area.
Yeah, I think they're, a lot of times they're overlooked. Mm-hmm. And I did find land plats. I even found the survey that Cornelius had talked about, and town plats. It's just fascinating, but it gives you an idea of where they lived And then when you also look at the terrain, it's just
Yes,
phenomenal.
the terrain and who were the neighbors. I've
Yeah.
always found it helpful to know who the neighbors were. Particularly, I kind of knew my third great grandparents' neighbors before I really started finding a whole lot of records about them. So when I started seeing witnesses, because he bought and sold a lot of land over his lifetime. In fact, he owned about the equivalent of 4 square acres of land. And, I knew, okay, that witness is a neighbor and that witness is a neighbor. And so I didn't have those maps, but I had the deeds that named who the properties were that abutted their properties. And so that was so helpful. But a friend of mine has Pennsylvania ancestors and has showed me some of the maps that you encountered. And they're just so wonderful for really understanding and knowing who the people were and everything. So.
Yeah, no, I love the maps.
So do you have anything else before we go that you definitely want to mention?
I would encourage people to talk to your loved ones, write down your memories of people. I was grateful I had a lot of those from my father, and start keeping your family history.
Okay.
It does make a difference.
Well, thank you for being our guest, and I want to remind our viewers, we're sponsored by the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. They meet the third Tuesday of the month. Right now, they're still doing everything via Zoom, but you can go to their website and you can register and come and join us, and hopefully you will join us after we are back into the building. And we also have a wonderful library. It is small, but it is jam-packed with helpful information. So you can also come and visit the library and take advantage of the resources that we have there. And hopefully you will join us again for another show.